In the year 700 BCE, a shadow fell across the ancient world that was far deeper and more terrifying than the sanitized versions of history we are often taught in classrooms. For while we remember the marble statues of Athens and the discipline of Rome, we frequently overlook the civilizations that thrived on darkness, where the drinking of wine from human skulls was a celebration, and the screams of children were silenced by the thunder of ritual drums. Beyond the familiar borders of classical antiquity lay empires and tribes whose brutality was not merely an act of war, but a fundamental pillar of the society and religion, creating a landscape of horror where terror was state policy and human sacrifice was an industrial undertaking. Across the vast and windswept steppes of Central Asia, stretching from the dark waters of the Black Sea all the way to the frontiers of China, a confederation of nomadic horsemen known as the Scythians rose to dominance around the 8th century BCE, establishing a reputation for savagery that would haunt the nightmares of Persians and Greeks alike for nearly 1,000 years. The Greek historian Herodotus, documenting their rise in the 5th century BCE, recoiled in fascination as he described customs that transformed the battlefield into a gruesome workshop of trophies, specifically the Scythian practice of turning their enemies into drinking vessels. When a Scythian warrior vanquished a foe in the heat of combat, the kill was only the beginning of the ritual, for he would take his enemy and make a precise circular incision just above the ears, allowing him to shake the skull free from its skin before using the rib of an ox to scrape away the flesh and tissue until the scalp was perfectly clean. This grisly prize was then softened and worked between the hands until it became as supple as a napkin, a trophy that the warrior would proudly attach to the bridle of his horse, signaling his prowess to his peers. For the man with the most scalps dangling from his steed was accorded the highest honors in their society. Yet the skull itself was destined for an even more macabre transformation, as the warrior would saw off the portion below the eyebrows and clean out the interior, curing the bone and wrapping the exterior in leather to create a cup, while the wealthy among them would gild the inside with pure gold to create a vessel fit for the most grotesque of toasts. These skull cups were not shameful secrets hidden in the dark corners of the tent, but were the centerpieces of Scythian hospitality, brought out to impress important guests as the host recounted the violent tale of how he had slain the man whose skull they now held. Archaeological excavations in the frozen tombs of southern Siberia have vindicated the ancient accounts of Herodotus, revealing skulls marked with the distinct horizontal cuts that prove these scalping rituals were a terrifying reality rather than a myth. Once a year, this culture of violence culminated in a ceremony where the district governor would prepare a massive bowl of wine, a communion of killers where only those who had slain an enemy were permitted to drink, leaving those who had not killed to sit apart in deep disgrace and shame, while the most lethal warriors were granted the honor of drinking from 2 cups simultaneously, cementing the idea that in Scythian society, death was the highest form of devotion. In the year 1920, on the sun-drenched coast of North Africa, where the great city of Carthage once rivaled Rome for control of the Mediterranean, archaeologists began to unearth a precinct that would shatter the modern understanding of Punic civilization and ignite a fierce historical debate about the true nature of Carthaginian religion. For 50 years, until 1970, excavators working in the Tophet of Salambo pulled layer after layer of tragedy from the earth, eventually revealing over 20,000 burial urns containing the charred bones of infants and young children, a discovery that forced scholars to ask if the Romans had been telling the truth all along about their enemies. The term Tophet, borrowed from Hebrew texts describing a site of sacrifice in Jerusalem, was applied to this 64,000 square foot cemetery, which served as an industrial-scale altar for the offering of human life to the gods Baal-Hamon and the goddess Tanit. The archaeological layers revealed centuries of continuous use, with urns buried beneath stones steelly inscribed with chilling dedications that spoke of vows made and debts paid by parents who believed that the life of their child was a currency to purchase divine favor during times of plague, famine, or war. When the survival of the city was at stake, the people of Carthage did not turn away from this horror, but embraced it with a terrifying piety, placing their own offspring into the sloping bronze arms of a statue of Baal, for which the children would slide into a roaring fire pit below, while the deafening beat of drums drowned out their cries to spare the parents from hearing the agony of their sacrifice. Modern scientific analysis of the bone fragments has dispelled the notion that these were merely cemeteries for natural infant deaths, as the remains show that while some were stillborn, a significant number were healthy children between birth and 3 months old, selected specifically to be extinguished in the flames. Historical record from the classical period describe moments of existential panic, such as the siege of 310 BCE, when the aristocracy of Carthage, fearing they had neglected their gods, sacrificed hundreds of their own children in a frantic bid for salvation. Despite attempts by revisionist historians to label these accounts as mere propaganda from rival nations, the sheer volume of physical evidence, from the inscriptions on the markers to the chemical composition of the bones, paints a picture of a sophisticated civilization that was simultaneously capable of dominating maritime trade and navigating the stars, while firmly believing that the incineration of their youth was a necessary act of holy devotion. In the year 231 BCE, the waters of the Adriatic Sea became a death trap for any merchant vessel foolish enough to cross them, as the Illyrian tribes of the Western Balkans united under a monarchy that turned piracy from a nuisance into a state-sponsored enterprise of terror. Under the rule of King Agron of the RDI, the Illyrians constructed a navy that was unlike anything the Mediterranean had seen, utilizing small, lightning-fast galleys known as lembi, which carried 50 rowers and 50 marines, designed to swarm larger merchant ships, overwhelm the crews, and vanish in a labyrinth of coves and islands along the coast before a counterattack could be mounted. This unchecked aggression brought the trade routes of the ancient world to a standstill, but the terror truly escalated when King Agron died. His widow, Queen Tuda, assumed the regency for her young stepson, declaring that the privateer's life was a lawful and noble profession for her people. Tuda unleashed her fleets with no restrictions, allowing her captains to raid not just ships but coastal cities, leading to incidents of profound treachery such as the raid where Illyrian pirates entered a Greek harbor disguised as peaceful merchants, setting up stalls and selling goods at low prices to lure in the unsuspecting population. Once the marketplace was packed with civilians, the Illyrians drew their hidden weapons, slaughtering the guards and dragging hundreds of men, women, and children back to their ships to be sold into slavery, a tactic that spread fear across the entire region. The audacity of the Illyrian pirate kingdom eventually provoked the rising power of Rome, especially after Tuda's forces began targeting Italian merchants, leading the Roman Senate to dispatch 2 ambassadors to demand that the queen reign in her subjects. When Tuda arrogantly dismissed the Roman envoys, claiming that piracy was an ancestral custom of Illyrian kings, and that she had no authority to stop her people from claiming what was theirs, and subsequently had one of the ambassadors assassinated on his journey home, she sealed the fate of her kingdom. In 229 BCE, Rome responded with the full weight of its military machine, launching the First Illyrian War and shattering Tuda's forces in a campaign that lasted 2 years, forcing her surrender and establishing the first Roman foothold in the Balkans. Yet the legacy of the Illyrian pirate kings and their rule of terror over the high seas remain a legendary chapter in the history of naval warfare. In the year 50 BCE, as the legions of Julius Caesar marched through the dense forests of Gaul and the mist-shrouded lands of Britain, they encountered a Celtic culture that possessed a spiritual worldview so alien and terrifying that it shocked even the battle-hardened sensibilities of the Roman military. The Celts were master metalworkers and artists, yet their religious life revolved around the cult of the severed head, which they believed to be the seat of the soul and the center of a person's being, making a collection of enemy heads a sacred necessity rather than mere barbarism. Roman observers like Caesar and the geographer Strabo recounted how Celtic warriors would ride from battle with the bloodied heads of their foes dangling from their horse's neck, later nailing them to walls of their homes, or preserving the heads of distinguished enemies in cedar oil to be displayed to guests with pride. Archaeological discoveries at sites like Grenay-sur-Orne in France have confirmed these grim accounts, unearthing sanctuaries where human skulls were arranged in intricate ritual patterns, while the dredging of the River Walbrook in London has produced dozens of skulls that testify to the widespread nature of this headhunting tradition. However, the Celtic ritual that most captured the imagination and horror of the ancient world was the Wicker Man, a colossal effigy woven from sticks and wood in the shape of a giant man, which the Druids would fill with living men and animals before setting the entire structure ablaze. While Caesar noted that criminals were preferred fuel for these sacrificial fires, he also recorded that in times of shortage, the Druids would not hesitate to round up innocent victims to ensure the gods were appeased, believing that a life must be paid to save a life during times of plague or war. Although some modern historians have debated the literal existence of the Wicker Man, suggesting it may have been Roman exaggeration, the physical evidence of ritual killing in Celtic lands is undeniable, most notably in the form of bod bodies like the Lindau man found in England. This ancient victim was subjected to a specific and horrific threefold death: bludgeoned on the head, strangled with a garrote, and having his throat cut before being deposited in the peat bog, a sequence of violence that aligns perfectly with medieval Irish texts describing ritual sacrifices to the gods of the earth and sky. In the year 1727, deep in the rainforests of West Africa, a European trader witnessed a spectacle of royal power and ritual slaughter that would cement the reputation of the kingdom of Dahomey as a state where the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable and washed in blood. This was the era of the annual customs, or swatanu, a grand and terrifying ceremonial cycle established by the kings of Dahomey to honor their royal ancestors, display the immense wealth of the kingdom, and renew the spiritual potency of the nation through mass human sacrifice. When a Dahomeyan king passed away, the transition of power was marked by the grand custom, a funeral rite of staggering proportions that could last for months and require the deaths of thousands of victims to ensure the king was accompanied into the afterlife by a retinue befitting his status. King Agaja, who had expanded the kingdom's borders through relentless military campaigns, formalized these practices, but the scale of the killing grew with each generation, as seen when King Pengla died in 1789, and his funeral rites claimed the lives of nearly 1,500 people over the course of 2 years. These sacrifices were not acts of mindless cruelty, but were driven by a deep theological conviction that the deceased king required wives, soldiers, and servants to maintain his dignity in the spirit world, leading many high-ranking officials to volunteer for death, viewing it as the ultimate badge of loyalty to their sovereign. The victims, primarily consisting of prisoners of war and criminals, were often beheaded in elaborate public ceremonies where the king himself might strike the first blow to demonstrate his absolute power over life, while the blood was collected to water the graves of the ancestors and the skulls were cleaned to decorate the palace walls. The European visitors who recorded these events were often paralyzed with horror, yet their protests were met with a firm explanation that these traditions were the glue holding society together, and that to abandon the sacrifices would be to invite the wrath of the ancestors and the collapse of the state. Recent scientific investigations into the palace of King Gizo had confirmed the most macabre details of these legends, as protein analysis of the wall mortar in the royal funerary huts revealed traces of human blood mixed with the oil and sacred water, proving that the very architecture of the Dahomey Palace was consecrated with the fluids of the dead. These civilizations, from the skull-collecting horsemen of the steppes to the pirate queens of the Adriatic and the priest kings of West Africa, remind us that the ancient world was a place of extreme duality, where magnificent artistic and military achievements walked hand in hand with rituals of blood and fire that challenged the limits of our modern comprehension.